The fork hit the plate harder than Commander Rowan Ashcroft expected, the small clink of silver against china loud enough to make her look up. "Come on, Sam. Everyone here already knows you just push paper." Lieutenant Miles Corbett said it lightly, a glass of bourbon halfway to his mouth, the easy grin of a man who'd said versions of this sentence 100 times before and never once paid for it. "You've never even been on a real mission. It's fine. Somebody's gotta file the reports." The table laughed. Her mother-in-law laughed. David's hand found hers under the tablecloth, the same quiet apology he always offered when his brother got going. Rowan set her own fork down slowly, deliberately, and said nothing at all. She had spent 14 years letting rooms like this one believe exactly what they wanted to believe. Tonight wasn't going to be the night that changed. She told herself that twice before she picked her water glass back up. She was wrong. 14 years earlier, a paracord bracelet had arrived in a plain manila envelope with no return address, the kind of gift that meant more than anything, with a receipt attached, ever could. Rowan kept it in the back of her sock drawer now, never worn, the woven strands still tight, and even despite the years. It had come from the last members of her unit still alive to send it, a quiet acknowledgement of a mission nobody outside a handful of cleared rooms would ever hear about. She took it out sometimes, late at night, turned it over in her hands, and put it back exactly where it belonged. She'd met David at a mutual friend's wedding 11 years ago, back when she was still technically active in operations that didn't officially exist in the places they happened. He'd asked what she did for a living, the ordinary opening question of every ordinary first conversation, and she'd given him the same answer she gave everyone. Administrative work, some logistics, nothing exciting. He'd believed her completely, the way most people did, and by the time their relationship had grown serious enough to warrant more honesty, she'd realized the honesty she owed him, and the honesty she was legally permitted to give him, were two very different things. David had made his peace with that boundary faster than most people could have. He'd learned, over the years, which questions yielded answers and which ones met a wall, and he'd stopped testing the wall long before she ever had to ask him to. It was, she sometimes thought, one of the quieter reasons she loved him. He never once made her choose between honesty and honor. His brother Miles had never learned that particular lesson, and Rowan doubted he ever would. Miles had grown up in the considerable shadow of their father, a decorated Navy SEAL who'd retired with commendations. Miles clearly measured his own career against every single day. He'd chosen surface warfare, worked hard to earn his rank, and somewhere along the way had convinced himself that being seen as impressive mattered more than actually being secure in what he'd accomplished. Family dinners were his favorite stage. He needed an audience the way other people needed sleep. And for years, without ever asking her permission, Rowan had been his favorite foil. She'd never minded the role, not really. It cost her nothing to let a room believe she processed paperwork for a living. She'd spent 14 years in rooms with no windows, on ships that didn't officially exist in certain waters on certain nights, doing work that belonged to the people who'd trusted her with it, not to her own reputation at a dinner table. Silence had never felt like sacrifice. Some nights, she found it almost restful. She counted exits in every room she entered, an old habit from a career spent assessing risk before assessing comfort, one that had never fully switched off even years into a quieter life. She did it now without thinking, at restaurants, at friends' houses, at family gatherings exactly like the one where Miles had made his comment about real missions. 2 exits in this dining room, one through the kitchen, one through the front hall. She'd cataloged them both before the appetizers arrived. Her fear of crowded elevators had started during a hostage recovery operation years earlier, a detail she'd never discussed with anyone outside a debriefing room, and one that occasionally surfaced in ordinary places, department store elevators, hotel lobbies, moments nobody around her would ever connect to anything but garden-variety claustrophobia. She managed it quietly, taking stairs when she could, standing near doors when she couldn't, and nobody at any family dinner had ever noticed the pattern enough to ask why. Master Chief Otis Brannigan had been the one who'd helped her build the careful architecture of her cover story years earlier, back when she'd first transferred toward more domestic postings and needed language flexible enough to survive family scrutiny without technically lying. Administrative work, logistics support. Both true in the narrowest possible sense, both engineered to close a conversation rather than open one. Brannigan checked in occasionally still, a gruff, familiar voice on the phone every few months, one of the only people outside her chain of command who understood exactly what her silence actually cost her. Miles had never been cruel exactly, not in the way that left visible marks. His comments arrived dressed as jokes, delivered with an easy grin that made objecting feel disproportionate, the kind of dismissal that was easier to absorb than to fight. Rowan had absorbed it for years, partly out of professional discipline, partly, if she was honest with herself, because correcting him had never once seemed worth the cost of explaining everything she couldn't explain. His fiancée, Priya, had only recently entered the family orbit, a soft-spoken architect who seemed, in Rowan's limited observation, both genuinely fond of Miles and quietly aware of the performance he put on for every room he entered. Rowan liked her, in the careful, distant way she liked most people she hadn't yet decided whether to trust completely. She wondered sometimes whether Priya saw the insecurity underneath Miles's bravado as clearly as Rowan did, or whether that particular recognition only came with years of watching someone perform the same anxious routine at every family gathering. David's parents adored Miles the uncomplicated way parents often adore the child who performs achievement loudly, and adored Rowan too, in a quieter register that never quite matched the volume Miles commanded. Rowan didn't resent it. She understood, better than most, how easy it was for a room to mistake volume for substance, and how rarely anyone thought to question a story told with enough confidence. That evening, watching him hold court about a training exercise off the Virginia coast, like he'd personally turned the tide of some larger war, she felt the old familiar patience settle over her, the one she'd worn through 100 rooms exactly like this one. She had no idea, reaching for her water glass, that an old friend of her father-in-law was about to end that patience for her, whether she was ready or not. She had, in truth, spent years quietly wondering what would happen if the wall between her two lives ever thinned enough for someone to see through it uninvited. She hadn't expected it to happen at a dinner table over roast chicken, in front of people who thought they already knew exactly who she was. David mentioned it almost in passing, the way he mentioned most things about his brother, half apology and half warning. Miles has been asking around, he said, drying a plate at the sink while Rowan finished loading the dishwasher. A friend at the Pentagon, someone in personnel records. He wants to know what you actually do. Rowan didn't look up from the silverware tray. Let him ask. You're not worried? I've had 14 years to get comfortable with people asking the wrong questions to the wrong offices. She closed the dishwasher door, more gently than the conversation deserved. He won't find anything he can use. She meant it when she said it. She wasn't entirely certain, 3 days later, that she still believed it. Master Chief Brannigan called on a Thursday evening, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man delivering information he'd rather not have to deliver at all. Your brother-in-law's making noise in some circles he shouldn't be making noise in, he said, no preamble, the way he'd always spoken to her since her first deployment under his supervision. Nothing that's going anywhere, but he's persistent, and persistent people occasionally get lucky, even when they're looking in the wrong place for the wrong reasons. How much does he actually know? Nothing. That's the point. He knows a name, Foster. He knows you were in the Navy. Everything after that runs into the same wall everyone runs into when they go looking for Task Group Cipher 9 without clearance. Brannigan's voice carried something almost like amusement. One of his inquiries landed on a desk 2 levels above his own security clearance. Somebody's going to have a quiet conversation with him about appropriate channels, probably sooner rather than later. Will that stop him? It might slow him down. Men like your brother-in-law don't usually stop until something makes the not knowing more uncomfortable than the knowing would be. Rowan sat with that assessment for a long time after the call ended, turning it over the way she once turned over threat assessments in briefing rooms half a world away. Miles wasn't dangerous in any conventional sense, but she understood, better than most people could, how ordinary curiosity could become something else entirely when it collided with a person's need to win. She found herself that night, taking the paracord bracelet out of her sock drawer and holding it longer than she usually allowed herself. It wasn't sentiment exactly, it was closer to a reminder, proof that the years Miles kept trying to reduce to paperwork had actually happened, had actually cost something, whether or not he was ever cleared to know the details. She put it back before David came upstairs, the way she always did. The quiet conversation Brannigan predicted arrived a week later, delivered not to Miles directly but to David, who relayed it with the weary patience of a man who'd spent his whole life absorbing his brother's fallout. Someone from his old CO's office called him in, David said. Told him, apparently in very clear terms, that continuing to inquire about a classified task force designation was going to draw exactly the kind of attention he didn't want drawn to himself. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. He didn't take it well. What did he say? That someone was covering for you. That the whole thing was some elaborate joke everyone was in on except him. David's jaw tightened, the particular tension he carried whenever his brother's insecurity curdled into something uglier. He's decided you're hiding something small and dressing it up as something big. I think it's easier for him to believe that than the alternative. Does Priya know any of this? Rowan asked. Some of it. Enough to be uncomfortable, I think, though she hasn't said much to me directly. David set the dish towel down, leaning against the counter. I get the sense she's noticed the same thing I have, that he needs this more than he's willing to admit, even to himself. Rowan thought of the few conversations she'd had with Priya, careful and pleasant, the kind two women exchange when they haven't yet decided how much of themselves to reveal to each other. She wondered whether Priya understood exactly what she was marrying into, or whether that understanding would arrive gradually, the way most difficult understandings did, in pieces too small to refuse until they'd already accumulated into something larger. Rowan understood the shape of that belief better than David did. Miles had built his entire identity on a scoreboard only he could see, one where being impressive mattered more than being secure, and admitting that the woman he'd spent years dismissing might have carried more weight than his own career ever had would require him to rebuild something in himself he wasn't ready to rebuild. It was easier to dig in. People like Miles almost always dug in. What she hadn't expected, hearing it from David 2 days later, was how far he intended to dig. He's invited us to Priya's engagement dinner, David said. Bigger guest list than usual. Some of his old commanding officers, a few staff members he spent years trying to impress. He watched her face for a reaction she didn't immediately give him. He wants an audience, Rowan. He wants to settle this in front of people whose opinion matters to him. She felt the familiar stillness settle over her, the one she'd worn through rooms far less comfortable than a family dinner table. Miles wanted a stage for the moment he finally put her in her place, the culmination of years spent needing to win against a scoreboard he'd never fully understood. Tell him we'll be there, she said. David studied her for a long moment, the particular look he gave her when he sensed the tide shifting beneath still water. You're sure about this? She thought of 14 years of careful silence, of a paracord bracelet in the back of a sock drawer, of every room she'd counted exits in, without anyone noticing why. She thought, too, of the quiet satisfaction in Brannigan's voice when he'd told her Miles's inquiries had hit a wall 2 levels above his clearance, a wall built, however indirectly, by the very career Miles refused to believe existed. I've never missed one of his events, she said. I'm not about to start with this one. David didn't press further. He'd learned, over 11 years, exactly when to trust her stillness and when to worry about it. Tonight, watching her set the paracord bracelet's memory carefully back into place in her own mind, he seemed to sense this was the former, whatever it ended up costing either of them. 3 weeks passed without a single mention of call signs or classified task forces, and Rowan let herself believe, cautiously, that the whole matter had finally exhausted itself. Miles seemed different at the next family dinner, quieter in a way that wasn't like him at all, choosing his words the way a man picks his way across ice he doesn't trust. He didn't bring up her career. He didn't bring up the Admiral's handshake from the Heritage Gala weeks earlier, still the elephant nobody at that table had fully addressed. Rowan almost let herself relax into the silence, mistaking it for resolution rather than reload. He's gone quiet, David told her afterward, driving home with the particular caution of a man reporting good news he didn't quite trust. Maybe he's finally let it go. Maybe, Rowan said, though something in her, the same instinct that had once told her not to trust an unlocked door in a compound that should have been empty, didn't quite believe it either. She was right not to. Brannigan called again 10 days later, his voice carrying none of its usual dry amusement. Your brother-in-law's found himself a new angle, he said. He's not going through official channels anymore. He's been talking to an old friend, someone who used to work personnel records, now retired, outside any chain of command that could stop him properly. What's he looking for? No records this time. Corroboration. He's been asking around, quietly, whether anyone's ever heard the name Sentinel attached to task group operations, hoping someone will either confirm it's nothing or hand him enough detail to discredit whatever he thinks the Admiral's greeting actually meant. Brannigan's voice hardened slightly. He's not trying to understand anymore, Rowan. He's trying to win an argument he's already decided he's losing. Rowan absorbed that without immediate reaction, the old professional stillness she'd built over 14 years of receiving difficult information without letting it show on her face. Is there anything he could actually find? Not through legitimate means, but men like your brother-in-law don't always stay within legitimate means once they've decided the stakes are personal rather than professional. What should I do? Nothing, for now. Let him keep talking to people who can't confirm anything he needs confirmed. The more he asks around without answers, the more he undermines his own credibility with the very people he's trying to impress. Brannigan paused. Though I'll say this much, Rowan. You've carried this quietly for a long time. There's no shame in letting a room see what's actually true, when the moment comes for it. That evening, sitting across from David at their kitchen table, she found herself turning over a thought she'd carried, unexamined, for longer than she wanted to admit. She could end this. A single phone call to Miles, a handful of carefully worded sentences that wouldn't violate anything classified but would satisfy enough of his curiosity to make the digging stop. She had the words. She'd always had the words. She'd simply never used them, choosing silence instead, year after year, partly out of discipline, and partly, she was beginning to admit to herself, out of something closer to reluctance, to hand Miles the satisfaction of an explanation. You could just tell him something, David said quietly, watching her face in the way he did when he sensed exactly where her thoughts had wandered. Not everything, just enough to make it stop. I could, Rowan admitted. I'm not sure I want to. David didn't push. He never did, not on this particular question, though she could see him weighing whether her reluctance was wisdom or something more complicated, something closer to letting a decade of small humiliations finally collect their debt in a single public reckoning. She wasn't entirely certain herself which one it was. Perhaps, she thought, it was both, tangled together in a way 14 years of discipline hadn't fully taught her to separate. She thought about Priya too, and what the engagement dinner might cost a woman who'd done nothing to deserve being caught in the middle of a decade-old family dynamic. That thought bothered her more than anything Miles himself could do. She considered, briefly, reaching out to Priya directly, offering some private context before the public evening arrived. She decided against it. It wasn't her story to soften on someone else's behalf, not when the person who'd built the conflict was the one who needed to face its consequences honestly. She called Priya anyway, 3 days before the dinner, not to explain anything, but simply to ask how she was holding up amid whatever tension had been building in the family around her own engagement. Priya's voice, when she answered, carried a careful weariness that told Rowan she understood more of the situation than anyone had directly told her. He's been strange for weeks, Priya admitted. I don't fully understand what's going on. and I'm not sure I want to be in the middle of it at my own engagement dinner. You're not the one who created this, Rowan said. Whatever happens, that's not on you. I know, Priya said, though her voice suggested she didn't entirely believe it yet. I just wish he'd let it go, whatever it is. Rowan didn't tell her it wasn't going to be let go. She simply thanked her for the honesty and let the conversation end there, understanding that whatever came next belonged to Miles to answer for, not to the woman who'd unknowingly agreed to marry into it. The engagement dinner's guest list arrived by email a week later, forwarded by David with a short note. Bigger than either of them expected, 24 names, several of them officers Rowan recognized from adjacent postings over the years, men and women who'd crossed paths with her career in ways Miles had no way of anticipating when he built his guest list to impress, rather than to expose. She scrolled through the names slowly, feeling something shift in her chest that wasn't quite anxiety and wasn't quite anticipation, something closer to recognizing the shape of a room before she'd even walked into it. Miles had built himself a stage. He had no idea how many people in that audience already knew exactly which performance was about to fail. Rowan, David's voice pulled her back from the list. Whatever happens that night, I need you to know I'm not asking you to protect him. Not anymore. She looked up at him, understanding, not for the first time, exactly why she'd trusted him with the parts of her life she couldn't trust to anyone else. I know, she said. I stopped protecting him 3 weeks ago, the moment Brannigan called. Then what are we protecting instead? She thought about that question longer than she expected to. Nothing, maybe, just letting the truth finally stand somewhere it's allowed to. David reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he'd made 100 times before, though it felt different that night, steadier, like he understood they were no longer simply waiting out his brother's insecurity, but standing at the edge of something that would finally resolve one way or another. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across white tablecloths at the officers' club, the particular polish of a room built to impress rather than comfort. Rowan counted the exits before she'd finished her first glass of wine, an old habit that hadn't loosened even here, surrounded by 24 guests in dress uniforms and cocktail attire. Miles worked the room the way he always did, easy handshakes, practiced laughter, angling his shoulders to make sure the right people saw him talking to the other right people. David stayed close at her side, quieter than usual, watching his brother orbit the room like a man determined to spend every ounce of goodwill he had before the night ended. Miles waited until dessert. That had always been his style. Let the wine do half the work first, let the room grow warm and unguarded before he made his move. He stood, glass in hand, ostensibly to offer a toast to Priya, and Rowan felt the shift in his voice before he'd even fully turned toward her. Before we get to the happy stuff, he said, smiling around the table, I want to clear something up. I think everyone here deserves to know the truth. His eyes found hers, and for the first time all evening, something underneath the performance showed through, not confidence, but a kind of desperation dressed up as confidence. Sam, why don't you tell everyone what you've actually done? No vague answers this time, no hiding behind classified information. Just tell them. The room went quiet in the particular uncomfortable way rooms go quiet when someone has decided to turn a dinner into a trial. Rowan felt David tense beside her, felt several of the older officers at the far end of the table exchange a glance that told her they recognized exactly what was happening and didn't care for it. She set her fork down, unhurried, and looked at Miles for a long moment before answering. I can't do that, she said simply. You know I can't. Miles's smile widened, triumphant now. He turned to the table like a man delivering a closing argument. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. There's nothing to tell. It's always been a story. A mystery everyone wants to believe, because it's more interesting than the truth. She processes paperwork, folks. That's it. That's the whole thing. He laughed, a short, satisfied sound, and lifted his glass like the matter was finally settled, like he'd wrestled the narrative back into his own hands after months of quiet unraveling. Rowan didn't defend herself. She never had, and she wasn't going to start now. in a room full of people who either already knew the truth or didn't need to. She held his gaze steady, understanding something Miles never had, that a lie only survives as long as the silence around it stays undisturbed. The silence broke almost immediately. Near the entrance, a Rear Admiral Rowan, recognized from 3 separate briefings over the years, had just stepped up to a small podium set up for the evening's formal toasts. He'd barely begun his opening remarks, something gracious about tradition and service, when his eyes caught hers across the room, and the words simply stopped in his mouth. Rear Admiral Everett Sowell set down his notes. Every head in the room turned to follow his gaze as he stepped down from the podium and began walking, unhurried and deliberate, straight toward their table, cutting a clean line through the crowd, like the rest of the room had ceased to exist. Miles's glass hovered halfway to his lips. Rowan watched the color drain slowly from his face as the realization crept over him, second by second, that this was not going to go the way he'd planned. "Commander Ashcroft," Sowell's voice carried easily across the now silent room. His hand was already extended before he reached her, and she took it, feeling every eye in the room settle on them at once. His grip was firm, familiar, the handshake of a man who'd shared more with her than a ballroom floor. "Admiral," she said, her voice level, the tone she'd used in 100 briefings where showing surprise was its own kind of failure. "It's good to see you." He held her hand a beat longer than protocol required, studying her face with something between warmth and quiet reverence. "I heard you'd transferred stateside. Didn't expect to run into you here, of all places." His glance took in Miles, David, the family resemblance between them, without needing an introduction. Something in his expression suggested he understood more about the dynamic in front of him than anyone had told him. "You're in good company tonight, I hope." "I am," Rowan said, and left it there. For a moment, standing there with the Admiral's hand still in hers, she let herself think of everything this room would never fully understand. The nights with no windows, the ship that hadn't officially existed in certain waters. The colleague she'd once had to leave behind for 11 unbearable hours before extraction cleared, a memory she'd never once shared with David in 11 years of marriage, not because she didn't trust him, but because some weight wasn't meant to be handed to someone who couldn't share the burden of actually carrying it. None of that belonged in a ballroom. She hadn't come here tonight for any of it to surface. She'd simply come here to stop pretending it hadn't happened at all. He didn't linger. Men at his level rarely could, pulled always toward the next obligation. But before he moved on, he turned back to her once more, his voice pitched just low enough to feel private, and just loud enough to be heard by everyone still watching. "The Navy doesn't forget what you did out there, Commander. Neither do I." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the current of the room, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than the quartet still playing somewhere in the background. Miles hadn't moved. He stood there with his glass forgotten in his hand, staring at the space where the Admiral had been, then at her, then back again, like a man trying to reconcile 2 versions of a story that could no longer both be true. The junior officers he'd spent the evening trying to impress were now looking at Rowan with an entirely different kind of attention. Not polite indifference, but genuine, unguarded curiosity. "Sentinel," one of them said quietly, almost to himself, testing the word like he was trying to remember where he'd heard it. "Wait, that Sentinel?" Rowan didn't answer. She didn't need to. Across the table, she watched something in Miles's face begin, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to crack open entirely. Priya reached for his hand under the table, her own expression a careful mixture of concern and something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a woman finally seeing clearly a dynamic she'd only sensed in pieces until now. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to either. The dinner limped forward after that, conversation resuming in fragments, guests exchanging quiet glances and quieter questions among themselves. Rowan ate the rest of her meal with the same unhurried composure she'd carried into the room, aware of the shift in the air around her without needing to acknowledge it directly. She had spent 14 years being underestimated by rooms exactly like this one. She understood, better than anyone at that table, that the moment didn't require her to say another word to finish landing. David's hand found hers beneath the tablecloth, gripping tighter than it had all evening. She glanced at him once, and saw in his face something she hadn't expected, not vindication exactly, but a kind of quiet pride he'd clearly been holding in reserve for years, waiting for a moment he'd never been sure would actually arrive. One of the older officers near the head of the table, a Captain Rowan vaguely recognized from a joint briefing years earlier, rose partway from his seat and began, quietly, to clap. Within seconds, the sound rippled outward, until most of the room was on its feet, a slow, deliberate ovation that had nothing performative in it at all. Miles remained seated through all of it, staring at his own hands like he no longer recognized them. The version of the evening he'd built for himself collapsing in real time in front of the exact audience he'd assembled to destroy hers. Rowan didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once toward the room, aware of David's hand still gripping hers, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not triumph, not victory, just a truth finally being allowed to stand on its own after 14 years of carrying it alone. Priya rose quietly at some point during the applause, crossed to where Rowan sat, and leaned down close enough that only she could hear. "I didn't know," Priya said, voice barely above a whisper. "Any of it. I'm sorry he made you carry this alone for so long." "You have nothing to apologize for," Rowan said. "None of this was yours to fix." Priya nodded, straightened, and returned to her seat beside Miles, who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't found anywhere yet to put the version of himself the evening had just quietly dismantled in front of everyone he'd hoped to impress. Miles didn't call for 2 full weeks after the engagement dinner, and Rowan found the silence almost stranger than anything he might have said. David reported fragments of it secondhand, the way he always did, delivered with the weary caution of a man watching his brother's world quietly rearrange itself. A fellow lieutenant had approached Miles at the gym, asking with genuine curiosity what it was like being related to Sentinel. Miles had laughed it off the first time, brushed past it the second, and by the third mention, something in him had visibly begun to shift. He wasn't used to being the secondary story in his own family. For years he'd built his entire self-image around being the one who'd chosen the harder path, the one who wore the uniform while everyone else played it safe. Now, piece by piece, that foundation was being quietly dismantled by men who'd actually served alongside the person he'd spent years dismissing as a paper officer. The deeper unraveling came from an unexpected direction. A commander Miles had once served under, a man he deeply respected, pulled him aside after hearing the story secondhand and mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd worked a joint operation years earlier, alongside a task force led in part by an officer known only by a single call sign, one still spoken of with a kind of reverence Miles had never once heard directed at himself. He didn't say it to embarrass him, David told her one evening, relaying the story with visible discomfort. He said it because he assumed Miles already knew. The assumption alone was its own quiet blow. Rowan absorbed that without much satisfaction. She had never wanted Miles humiliated by strangers. She had simply wanted, after 14 years, for the truth to stop requiring her constant management. Miles came to her door, alone on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the dinner, without David there to soften whatever was about to happen. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, the easy swagger gone, replaced by something uncertain and unpracticed. She invited him in. They sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she and David had spent so many quiet nights turning this entire situation over. And for a long moment, Miles simply stared at his hands, saying nothing at all. "I don't know what to say to you," he finally admitted, his voice stripped of its usual polish. "I spent years thinking I understood exactly where I stood, compared to you. Turns out I didn't understand anything." Rowan didn't rush to fill the silence for him. She let him sit in it the way she'd learned to sit in silences far heavier than this one, understanding that whatever came next needed to come from him, unhurried, without her softening the shape of it. He looked up eventually, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was no performance in his expression at all, just a man confronting plainly how small his understanding of the world had actually been. "I've spent my whole life needing to be the one who did something," he said quietly. "I never once considered that the person I was competing with might have already done more than I could imagine, and just never felt the need to say so." Rowan studied him for a moment. This man, who'd spent years measuring his worth against a woman he'd never bothered to actually know, and felt something soften in her that she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness yet. That would come later, on its own terms. But something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sight of a man finally standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer avoid. His apology, when it finally arrived in full, didn't come as a single dramatic sentence. It unfolded slowly over the following weeks, in small gestures more than grand words. A phone call just to ask how her week had gone. An offer to help David fix the fence line behind their house. A quiet correction when a cousin at a barbecue made an offhand joke about desk jobs that Miles once would have laughed along with. The conversation that mattered most happened, fittingly, at another family dinner, the kind of ordinary Sunday gathering that had once been the site of his cruelest joke. The table was the same, the room was the same, but everything around it had shifted in ways that had nothing to do with furniture. Miles stood partway through the meal, and for a moment her chest tightened instinctively, some old reflex bracing for another performance. But his face wasn't wearing that expression this time. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning to her directly, rather than to the room at large. "Not just for the comment at dinner months ago. I've spent years making you smaller than you are, because it made me feel bigger than I was. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was." He paused, searching for the rest of it, unwilling to let himself off easily. "I'm sorry for every time I made you shrink at your own family's table." Rowan let the words settle before she answered, the way she'd learned to let important things settle, rather than rushing to smooth them over. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it fully, without reservation. "But I want you to understand something too. Respect isn't earned by talking about what you've done. It's earned by staying quiet after you've done it." He nodded slowly, and she saw the words land somewhere real in him, not just as absolution, but as a lesson he intended to carry forward. Around the table, something had changed in the way everyone was watching them, not the charged discomfort of the engagement dinner, but something gentler, the quiet attentiveness of a family finally seeing each other clearly. David reached over and took her hand under the table, the same gesture he'd made 100 times before, though it felt lighter now, no longer carrying the weight of a secret they'd had to protect alone between the two of them. His parents watched it all with a kind of quiet pride Rowan hadn't seen from them before. Priya, who'd witnessed the worst of it firsthand at her own engagement dinner, offered Rowan a small warm smile from across the table, one woman to another, acknowledging something that needed no further explanation. Miles lifted his glass then, and this time there was nothing performative in the gesture at all. "To my sister-in-law," he said, his voice steady. "The bravest sailor I've ever met." Glasses rose around the table, a soft chorus of agreement, and Rowan felt 14 years of quiet, necessary silence settle into something that finally resembled being fully seen. She didn't need the toast. She'd built a life that never depended on anyone's recognition, because recognition had never been the point of any of it. Not the missions, not the medals gathering dust in a drawer nobody else was cleared to open. But she wouldn't pretend the toast meant nothing either. There was a particular quiet grace in finally being understood by the people who shared her table, even after 14 years of never asking them to. A year later, the paracord bracelet still lives in the back of Rowan's sock drawer, though she takes it out more often now, no longer quite so private a ritual. Miles calls most weeks, ordinary conversations about nothing in particular, the kind of calls that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. He helped David finish the fence line last spring, and the two brothers have settled into something that looks, for the first time in either of their adult lives, like an actual friendship rather than a lifelong competition neither of them asked to enter. Rear Admiral Sowell retired 8 months after the engagement dinner, and sent Rowan a short note before his retirement ceremony, thanking her, in careful language, for reminding an entire room what quiet service actually looked like. She keeps the note in the same drawer as the bracelet, alongside a growing quiet collection of things she no longer needs to hide from anyone who matters. Priya and Miles married that autumn, a smaller ceremony than the engagement dinner had been, and Rowan stood as one of the witnesses, an honor she hadn't expected and accepted without hesitation. Master Chief Brannigan came to the wedding too, a surprise Rowan hadn't arranged, though she suspected David had quietly extended the invitation on his own. He shook Miles's hand at the reception with the particular gruff formality of a man who'd spent a career deciding exactly who deserved his respect, and told him, in a low aside Rowan only caught secondhand, that apologizing well mattered almost as much as never needing to in the first place. Otis Brannigan retired from active consulting the following spring, though he still calls Rowan every few months, the same gruff, familiar voice checking in on a woman he'd once helped build a careful architecture of silence around, and now watches, with visible satisfaction, dismantle it on her own terms. Here's the part of this story worth sitting with before deciding how you feel about it. Rowan had the words to end Miles's years of dismissiveness at almost any point along the way. A single honest conversation early on might have spared both of them years of quiet friction. She chose silence instead, partly out of professional discipline, and partly, if she's honest with herself even now, because some portion of her wanted the truth to arrive on her own terms rather than volunteer it on his. If you'd spent years being underestimated by someone who should have known better, would you have corrected them the first time, quietly, privately, before resentment had years to compound? Or would some part of you have waited too, letting the silence build toward a moment more satisfying than an early, quiet correction ever could have been? There's no clean answer to that question, and that's precisely why it's worth asking. Rowan's silence protected classified information that genuinely needed protecting, but it also, if she's honest, protected something more personal, a kind of quiet reckoning she'd been saving without fully admitting it to herself. David still doesn't know everything. There are details of certain missions that will never leave the rooms where they happened, not because he isn't trusted, but because some weight was never meant to be shared, only carried. He's made his peace with that boundary years ago, the same peace he made with every wall he learned not to test. It's one of the quieter reasons she loves him, still, all these years later. If this story stayed with you, there's a whole shelf of others like it here on Steel Honor. Women who found the truth buried under someone else's assumptions and let it surface exactly when it needed to. Subscribe if you want the next one when it lands, and tell us in the comments whether you'd have spoken up sooner or waited the way Rowan did. Some kinds of strength announce themselves loudly, in front of 24 guests and a rear admiral's handshake. Others simply wait, patient and unhurried, for the moment they're finally allowed to stand on their own. Rowan has stopped needing anyone's applause to know which kind she carries, but she no longer minds either when it arrives.